In the frozen stillness of a Belgian winter morning, December 17, 1944, a sound echoed through the Ardennes that was more terrifying than artillery or gunfire. It was the sound of nothing. The massive King Tiger, 70 tons of steel, firepower, and German engineering, rolled a few meters through the pre-dawn haze and stopped dead. No roar of its Maybach engine, no grinding of treads, just a ghostly puff of steam rising into the cold air. Standing on the turret was the man who led one of the most feared armored formations of the Waffen-SS, Colonel Joachim Peiper. He slammed his fist against the frozen armor, but the tank didn't even shudder. The engine wasn't stalled. It was done. And the problem didn't end with this one tank. Peiper lifted his eyes and saw the nightmare stretching out across the forest road. Through the drifting fog of the Ardennes wound the entire might of his formation. Kampfgruppe Peiper, 67 tanks, hundreds of armored vehicles, nearly 5,000 elite SS soldiers, all of them frozen in place. The armored spearhead meant to punch a hole straight through the American lines and swing the tide of the war had become a steel traffic jam in the woods, too heavy to push, too complex to repair here, too precious to abandon. This wasn't a setback, it was a disaster. The entire German offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, depended on speed, on smashing through American defenses before they even understood what was happening. But Peiper's unstoppable armored fist had been stopped by something far more lethal than enemy fire. Every fuel gauge read empty. This wasn't a clerical error, not an unlucky delay, not a mishandled convoy. It was the visible symptom of a fatal disease eating Germany from the inside. And Peiper had known the risk from the very beginning. His orders were not just to attack, they were to hunt. The entire offensive relied on one insane premise. Germany would advance using captured American fuel. The nation that invented blitzkrieg could no longer fuel its own blitz. If Peiper didn't find gasoline immediately, the great breakthrough would die here, before it even began. As the morning mist thinned, a small silhouette appeared ahead, the Belgian village of Hounsveld. American troops had abandoned it in such panic that coffee was still warm in cups, and fireplaces were still glowing. And then Peiper saw it, rows upon rows, thousands of American jerry cans, stacked like an army of metal bricks. A junior officer cracked one open, inhaled cautiously, and his expression changed instantly. High-octane American gasoline. In seconds, Peiper's men were leaping off their vehicles, wrenching open canisters, filling thirsty engines like desperate men drinking water after days in the desert. Peiper walked through the rows of fuel, doing the numbers in his head. 50,000 gallons. Enough to feed every tank, half-track, and truck in the entire Kampfgruppe. Enough to reignite the offensive. Enough to carry them toward the Meuse River and maybe, just maybe, toward victory. For a fleeting moment it felt like salvation. But then, in the middle of this miraculous find, a cold realization crept into Peiper's mind. A question he couldn't shake. A question far more chilling than the winter wind. Why would the Americans abandon something so precious? What kind of enemy leaves behind what Germany considers a war-winning treasure? This wasn't a gift, it was a warning. And Peiper sensed, long before the high command understood it, that empty fuel tanks were only the beginning of a much darker truth. Peiper's uneasy question, why would the Americans leave so much fuel behind, echoed in his mind as his men frantically refilled their tanks. But to understand why that question was so terrifying, you have to look at the state of Germany in late 1944. Because by that winter, the Third Reich wasn't just struggling, it was running dry, literally. For months, Allied bombers had been pounding the Reich's synthetic fuel plants with relentless precision. The massive Luna works, the heart of Germany's artificial fuel industry, had seen its output collapse by over 95%. Other facilities, once humming with the machinery of war, had become industrial graveyards. The refineries at Pölitz, Blechhammer, and Bruck were operating at less than 10% capacity. Some days they produced no usable fuel at all. Germany's reserves were gone. Its access to oil was evaporating. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, had already warned the Führer in bleak, unvarnished numbers. Germany no longer had the ability to wage a mobile war. It wasn't just tanks that were starving. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was grounding its advanced fighters, not for lack of pilots, but for lack of aviation fuel. Training hours had dropped from hundreds to barely 60. New pilots were being sent into battle, barely knowing how to fly their own aircraft. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had become a shadow of its former self. Battleships and cruisers rusted uselessly in their harbors, unable to leave port. On the home front, things were even more dire. Civilian driving had been banned for years. Gasoline was treated like contraband. The Gestapo launched full-scale investigations into the theft of a single leader. The once unstoppable war machine that had conquered half of Europe was reverting to horse-drawn wagons. But the true shock, the blow that Peiper felt forming in his gut, came from comparing this miserable reality to the unimaginable power of the United States. Because in 1944, America didn't just have an oil industry. America was the oil industry. That year, the United States produced a staggering 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, even with every synthetic plant and every drop from the Romanian oil fields, managed just 30 million, less than 2% of American output. And one American oil field, the East Texas field, produced more fuel alone than all of Axis-controlled Europe combined. This wasn't a disadvantage. It was a canyon. While German logisticians were desperately rationing fuel by the liter, calculating every mile a tank could move, the Americans were dealing with a completely different problem. They had too much. So much that they had to invent new ways to move it. They built the Red Ball Express, a roaring, nonstop highway system operated by nearly 6,000 trucks, moving supplies 24/7. These trucks delivered 1,200 tons of fuel, ammunition, and food every single day, and the fuel burned by the trucks of the Red Ball Express alone exceeded what an entire German army group received in a month. But even that wasn't enough. So the Allies performed an engineering miracle, Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. Flexible fuel pipes were laid across the bottom of the English Channel, pumping more than 1 million gallons of gasoline a day directly from Britain into France. From there, an entire vascular system of pipelines branched out across Europe, arteries delivering the lifeblood of mechanized war straight to the front lines. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel a day, and their logistical network was delivering 1.4 million. They were fighting one of the largest land battles of the war and still adding 200,000 gallons to their reserves every single day. This was the world Peiper's men were thrust into as they refueled at Honsfeld. Their precious find, those 50,000 gallons, was a miracle to them. But to the Americans, it was less than 5% of what they pumped across the channel every day. A rounding error, a drop in an ocean of oil. And as the SS soldiers worked feverishly to bring their engines back to life, the evidence of America's overwhelming power continued to pile up. In the village's abandoned office, one of Peiper's sergeants found shipping documents written in English. He brought them to his commander. The papers traced the journey of this gasoline. Refined in Texas, shipped to New York, loaded onto a tanker where it crossed the Atlantic to Liverpool, pumped across the Channel to Normandy, and then trucked 400 miles to this tiny Belgian depot, a journey of more than 6,000 miles, completed in 6 weeks. Peiper read the papers, crumpled them in his gloved hand, and said nothing. But his men noticed his face drain of color. Then another soldier found something even stranger, a stack of stars and stripes, the American military newspaper. The issues were dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headline: the opening of a brand new pipeline capable of delivering 300,000 gallons of fuel per day. A single secondary pipeline, just one part of America's network, delivered 6 times more fuel daily than the miracle Peiper had just captured. Whatever sense of triumph his men had felt evaporated instantly. They weren't fighting another army, they were fighting an industrial supercontinent. And Peiper was only beginning to understand what that really meant. The engines of Peiper's armored column finally growled back to life. American gasoline surged into German cylinders, and for a moment the Ardennes echoed again with the rumble of steel beasts awakening from death. To Peiper's men, it felt like resurrection. To Peiper himself, it felt like a stay of execution. With their tanks refueled, Kampfgruppe Peiper resumed its deadly thrust westward, the spearhead of Hitler's final bid to break the Western Front. And as they rolled out of Hunsfeld, they struck more abandoned American supply sites. Food, ammunition, fuel, everything the Wehrmacht was starving for. Each discovery seemed to confirm the same illusion. The Americans are fleeing. We are unstoppable. The road to the Meuse is open. But that illusion would not survive the day. At the next captured outpost, German troops seized American maps, real, detailed, updated maps of U.S. logistical networks, and what they revealed to Peiper was worse than any battlefield defeat. Fuel depots weren't rare, they were everywhere, at every crossroads, behind every sector, in every village and town within reach of the front lines. The U.S. First Army alone had more than 3.5 million gallons of fuel stored just behind the forward positions. Millions more sat further to the rear. Compared to the United States, Germany wasn't just outmatched. It was outclassed by a different level of existence. Still, Peiper pushed onward, driving his men harder and faster. The pressure to advance, to reach the Meuse before the offensive collapsed, was crushing. And as fuel levels dropped again, the desperation of his troops twisted into brutality. During this frantic surge forward, Kampfgruppe Peiper committed one of the most infamous war crimes of the entire conflict, the Malmedy massacre, where 84 unarmed American prisoners were murdered. Peiper would later claim that he couldn't spare the fuel to transport prisoners to the rear. He couldn't risk slowing down. He couldn't waste anything. Fuel wasn't just logistics, it was morality, it was strategy, it was survival. As daylight faded on December 17th, Peiper's armored vanguard reached the outskirts of a town called Stavelot, and there, beyond the last line of houses, something rose into view that made every German soldier catch his breath. A sprawling sea of jerry cans, tank trucks, barrels, and storage tanks, the largest American fuel depot in the entire sector. Over 2 million gallons of gasoline. The mother lode, enough to carry Peiper not just to the Meuse, but all the way to Antwerp, enough to potentially turn the entire Ardennes offensive from desperate gamble into explosive triumph. For a moment, it looked like destiny. But then they saw movement. American engineers, 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, led by Captain John Brewster, were swarming the depot, but they weren't trying to save it. They weren't loading fuel. They weren't preparing to fight. They were preparing to destroy it. Brewster's orders were simple and absolute. Deny the fuel to the enemy at any cost. His men worked with terrifying efficiency. Gasoline was poured in the long trails across the ground, forming rivers between the stacks of cans. White phosphorus grenades were distributed. And just as the first German tanks crested the ridge and the depot filled their gun sights, Brewster nodded. A sergeant pulled the pin on a phosphorus grenade. He tossed it into a fuel-soaked trench. What happened next was apocalyptic. A wall of flame erupted so violently that the shockwave could be felt in Stavelot itself. Within seconds, the entire 15-acre depot became a volcanic inferno. Flames climbed hundreds of feet into the sky. A plume of smoke rose so high it was visible from more than 100 miles away. The inferno burned for 3 straight days. 2 million gallons of precious fuel Germany would have killed to obtain, rose into the air as black, choking clouds. Peiper watched it happen from the turret of his command tank, silent, stunned, illuminated by the apocalyptic glow. One of his men later recalled the words he murmured as the flames devoured their last hope. "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to deny them to us. What are we even doing here?" That single sentence captured the collapse of the German dream, because what happened at Stavlo wasn't an isolated act. Across the entire front, U.S. engineers were doing the same thing. At Spa, they torched 2.5 million gallons. At Francorchamps, they burned another million. In just the first week of the battle, American forces deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of their own fuel. To the German High Command, this was incomprehensible madness. 8 million gallons was more fuel than they had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. But to the Americans, it was sound strategy, necessary, replaceable. Fuel to them was not treasure, it was infinite. While Peiper's tanks were sputtering and dying, while his men siphoned gasoline from wrecked vehicles and prayed for miracles, the U.S. Army Air Forces were flying C-47 cargo planes into the besieged town of Bastogne. Those planes dropped not only food and ammunition, but 160,000 gallons of gasoline in a single day. They were delivering more fuel to one surrounded town than Peiper's entire armored group possessed. The realization was spreading through the German ranks like frostbite. This battle was already lost. The war was already lost. Not because of bravery, not because of tactics, not because of heroism, but because of arithmetic, because of fuel, because the Americans had so much they could burn it as a weapon. By December 20th, the illusion of momentum, of a breakthrough, of destiny, had collapsed entirely. Peiper's armored spearhead, once the pride of the Waffen-SS, was bleeding fuel faster than it could capture it, and every hour brought worse news. The supply columns meant to deliver the next precious shipments of fuel never appeared. Instead, radio messages crackled through the static. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. That single sentence sealed Peiper's fate more decisively than any American ambush. He gathered his officers. The mood was grim. There was no shouting, no anger, just cold numbers. One officer spoke the truth none of them wanted to confront. "We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30. Silence. In that moment, everyone understood. They weren't going to reach the river. They weren't going to take Antwerp. They weren't even going to escape. Fuel, the very thing the entire operation depended on, had run out. And what little remained wasn't going to the tanks. It was being siphoned for something far more humiliating, to blow up their own vehicles. The order came that night. They were to abandon the machines that made Kampfgruppe Peiper feared across Europe, then destroy them completely. His elite armored warriors, men who had trained their entire lives to fight inside steel beasts, now moved silently through the forest, planting explosives inside their irreplaceable equipment. 39 Tiger II and Panther tanks, more than 70 armored half-tracks, over 100 trucks, cars, and support vehicles. They drained the last drops of precious gasoline not into fuel tanks, but into demolition charges. Fuel no longer powered engines. It powered their funeral. Under the cover of darkness, the charges blew one after another. The forest lit up in flashes of white and orange as some of Germany's finest armored machines died at the hands of their own crews. The explosions echoed through the hills like the death rattles of an empire. And then, with the snow crunching under their boots, Joachim Peiper and the remaining 770 survivors of his original 5,000-man force slipped away on foot, vanishing into the winter forest. They left behind millions of Reichsmarks worth of machinery, destroyed not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. It was over, the air war that made retreat impossible. Just 5 days earlier, dense fog had grounded Allied aircraft. But on December 23rd, the sky finally cleared. And when it did, the full industrial might of the Allied air forces unleashed hell. More than 2,000 sorties launched that day alone. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a flying tank, burned 300 gallons of fuel per hour. The B-26 Marauder medium bomber used 200 gallons per hour. Transport planes bringing supplies burned hundreds more. In one afternoon, Allied aviation consumed more fuel than the entire Luftwaffe received in a month. Planes screamed overhead, bombing crossroads, strafing convoys, slicing apart German columns already crippled by fuel shortages. Peiper's already doomed force was now under relentless industrial-scale aerial assault. They couldn't move, they couldn't hide, they couldn't fight back. The snow around them churned with explosions. Every road became a trap. Every clearing became a kill zone. Their last hope, mobility, had been stripped away. A war lost in the rear, not the front. Historians love to debate tactics, flanking maneuvers, armor engagements, command decisions. But what happened to Kampfgruppe Peiper revealed a much harsher truth. Wars are not won by courage. Wars are not won by brilliant generals. Wars are won by fuel. American factories, refineries, and logistics networks, 6,000 miles away, destroyed a German armored division without firing a single shot. Because no matter how elite Peiper's men were, no matter how advanced the Tiger II tanks were, none of it mattered if the engines stayed cold. And in December 1944, Germany's engines were dying. When American recovery crews eventually reached Peiper's abandoned vehicle park near La Glaise, they were stunned. Many of the destroyed German tanks were still operable, their systems intact, their optics untouched, their engines capable of running. All that was missing was fuel. The official U.S. report noted that to get all 39 tanks running again would require only 8,000 gallons. Where would that fuel come from? The report answered with chilling simplicity. Source: local reserves. The time needed to refuel and recommission all 39 tanks? 4 hours. Fuel that was a priceless war-saving treasure for Germany was, for the Americans, a casual logistical errand, something they could gather locally, in a morning. That was the true discovery at Honsfeld. Not that the Americans had more fuel, but that they lived in a completely different universe, one where their waste exceeded Germany's total need. Peiper realized it too late, and so did the rest of Germany. The war had not been lost in the forests of the Ardennes. It had been lost in the factories of Texas, California, Oklahoma, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The collapse of Kampfgruppe Peiper was not just the failure of one unit. It was the symbolic death of something much larger, the end of the myth that had terrified Europe for half a decade, the myth of the unstoppable German war machine. For years, Nazi propaganda and even Allied soldiers believed the same story. The German soldier was superior, the German tank was unbeatable, and German tactics could overcome any disadvantage. But the frozen ruins of La Glaise told a different truth. A truth written in empty fuel gauges. The industrial equation. Germany could never solve. Germany did not lose the Ardennes offensive because its soldiers were untrained. They were some of the most experienced veterans in the world. It didn't lose because its tanks were inferior. On paper, the Tiger II was arguably the most formidable tank in Europe. It didn't lose because of poor tactics. Many German officers were brilliant and cunning. It lost because none of that mattered anymore. By late 1944, the war had transformed into something Germany was never built to win, an industrial duel on a planetary scale. And in that kind of war, only one variable mattered: who could feed their machines? The Allies could. Germany couldn't. a nation starving for fuel. The numbers were merciless. In 1944, the Allied oil advantage over the Axis was more than 50-1, not 5-1, not 10-1, 50-1. It didn't matter how many Tiger tanks Germany built. Each one burned 2.5 gallons of fuel per mile in combat. Peiper's column alone required tens of thousands of gallons just to move between villages. Meanwhile, the American Sherman, lighter, faster, easier to maintain, used less than a gallon per mile. American trucks used standardized parts. Engines could be swapped in minutes. Fuel could be delivered by pipeline, ship, truck, or aircraft. The German army, by contrast, was a museum of improvised logistics. French tanks, captured Soviet trucks, homemade fuel blends, engines that needed different oils, different filters, different tools. Every vehicle was a logistical nightmare. While the Americans operated like a modern corporation, Germany operated like a scrapyard with ambition. When arithmetic defeated heroism, Peiper's story proved something that no ideology could hide. Heroism is irrelevant when the enemy has more fuel than you have courage. Allied fighters roared overhead, burning in a single hour what Peiper's entire division now lacked. American trucks delivered in an afternoon what Germany rationed for a month. The United States could supply one pocketed town with more gasoline than an elite SS armored group could gather in a week of desperate looting. The contrast was so extreme it bordered on surreal. Germany was fighting like a regional power from the 19th century. America was fighting like the world's factory. This wasn't a battle, it was a math problem, and Germany had failed the equation. The final irony at La Glaise. When American recovery teams entered La Glaise after the battle, they found something astonishing. Dozens of German tanks, including King Tigers, were still in almost perfect condition. Optics intact, tracks functional, engines capable of running. They had not been defeated by American guns. They had been defeated by empty fuel tanks. The American report was almost mocking in its simplicity. To get all 39 tanks operational again would require only 8,000 gallons of gasoline. Source: local reserves. Not the Red Ball Express, not emergency shipments, not strategic reserves, just local. They estimated the time required to refuel and recommission all tanks: 4 hours. 4 hours to undo what had destroyed an entire elite German formation. Fuel that to Germany was a holy relic worth killing for, to America was a logistical footnote. The true battlefield of the modern era. What happened to Kampfgruppe Peiper was more than a military defeat. It was a revelation about the nature of modern war. Modern wars are won by industry, not ideology. By refineries, not rhetoric. By oil fields, not oaths. By logistics officers, not charismatic leaders. Germany never had a chance in an industrial war against a nation that produced more oil than the rest of the world combined. And when Peiper's tanks died, so did the last illusion that tactical brilliance could overcome strategic starvation. A steel monument to a lost war today. In the quiet Belgian village of La Glaise, one of Peiper's abandoned King Tigers still sits where it was left. Massive, cold, motionless, not destroyed by artillery, not blown apart by explosives, not crippled by mechanical failure, but stopped forever by the simplest and most devastating reality of the war. The fuel ran out. A 70-ton monument to the truth that decided the fate of the 20th century. Courage means nothing when the tank is empty. Logistics always wins. Today, in the quiet Belgian village of La Glaise, surrounded by hills and forests that once echoed with the thunder of war, a single tank rests in the cold. A King Tiger, massive, intimidating, seemingly indestructible. Its armor is unscarred, its barrel still points across the valley. Its engine, if fed, could almost certainly run again, but it never will, because this 70-ton monster didn't die in battle. It didn't fall to artillery or rockets. It wasn't destroyed by Allied bombs. It stopped because the fuel ran out. And there it remains, frozen, not in metal, but in meaning. Visitors walk around it today not to admire German engineering, but to learn the lesson that brought an empire to its knees. In modern war, logistics aren't the back line. Logistics are the front line. The Tiger II didn't fail because it was poorly built. It failed because the industry behind it was. Germany's engineers built extraordinary machines. Germany's factories couldn't feed them. And Germany's strategy, bold, ruthless, aggressive, collapsed against a simple, devastating truth. The United States could outproduce, outfuel, and outlast everything the Reich could imagine. The Battle of the Bulge was not a tactical defeat. It was a mathematical one, a duel between a continental power and an industrial superpower, between a nation rationing liters and a nation burning millions of gallons just to deny them to the enemy. The story of Kampfgruppe Peiper is the story of that imbalance. An elite armored spearhead undone by empty tanks. The most advanced tanks in Europe abandoned intact. A division defeated not by courage or cowardice, but by fuel. And the King Tiger in La Glaise stands as one final reminder. Even the strongest armor cracks under the weight of failed logistics. Even the most fearsome weapon becomes useless without fuel. Even the most experienced soldiers cannot march faster than arithmetic. War is not won by the bravest men, the best machines, or the loudest speeches. War is won by the side that can keep its engines running. And on that frozen December in 1944, the German engines died. The American engines didn't. And that, more than any battle map or famous speech, decided the fate of Europe. In the end, courage may inspire war, but logistics wins it.